Time now for an in-depth look at the market news on this Wednesday, and for that I'm joined on the line by Dr. Jun-sok, professor of economics at the Catholic University of Korea. Professor Yang, good to have you back on.
Happy to be here.
Well, we see the tensions between the U.S. and China easing somewhat when it comes to trade, also getting ever closer to a vaccine, but stocks on Wall Street overnight were mixed. What's the story in the global markets and here in Korea?
Okay, well, after rising most of the last weekend on Monday, the U.S. stock, as you just mentioned, had a mixed performance. S&P and NASDAQ continued to rise very slightly, but Dow fell slightly. Fundamentally, it seems like it's just a part of the normal up and down of the market, but the rise in S&P and NASDAQ may reflect the tech shares in the stock indices, which are doing incredibly well. The Microsoft, Apple, Facebook, and so on, compared to, say, manufacturing stocks, which are doing somewhat mediocrely because of the COVID virus. The lowering of the Dow may also represent the changes in Dow index, which is happening right now. They're dropping 3 companies and adding new companies, so that may account for some of the differences between the Dow index and the other indices. And then another factor is that the Fed will hold a meeting of monetary policy, what they call the Jackson Hole meeting, on Thursday, and people are waiting to see what the Fed Chairman Powell will say. So the stock market seems to be in sort of a holding pattern, and even the U.S.-China high-level meeting did very little to help or hurt the market. Both sides in the meeting, the U.S. side and the Chinese side, both reaffirmed commitment to the Phase 1 trade deal, even though China is running far behind the pace and purchasing promised amount of U.S. goods. For example, China has only bought about 20% of what it promised for agricultural goods and about 5% of what it promised to buy for energy goods. But both sides have an incentive to keep the deal going right now. China to reduce the friction between the U.S. and China on trade, for President Trump on the U.S. side to do better on his re-election possibilities. Now, European market and the Asian market, they also seem to be in a holding pattern. Again, they seem to be waiting to see what Chairman Powell will say in the Jackson Hole meeting, and that also applies to Korea as well. KOSPI and KOSDAQ has been rising this week, and it rose today as well, but the percentage of increase has fallen drastically, and again, the interpretation seems to be that everybody's sort of waiting to see what the Fed will say.
Well, now there are some signs of weakness in Korea's manufacturing sector, which has been supporting the local economy while other sectors have been hit so hard. This could further impact employment. Tell us about that and what might be done about it.
Okay, well, the research institute in Korea has published a report saying that of the 10 major industries in Korea, 2 are not doing very well. That's rubber and plastics and processed metals. 3 are in sort of a holding pattern. It's not improving or not worsening. That includes the automobile industry. And 5 industries are productivity is increasing. That includes electronics and semiconductors. But fundamentally, I think it does reflect what a lot of people have been saying about the Korean economy lately, which is that the productivity is too low. For example, the last OECD report, which came out a few weeks ago, the Korean labor productivity was ranked 31st out of 36 countries in the OECD, around the level of Poland, Greece, and Latvia, and way below the OECD average. And also, Korea has the 5th largest level of product market regulations, which implies that there's less competition, so less room for innovation, improvement, and also relatively higher prices for the same good. And similar results were seen in the IMD International Competitiveness Report that was issued earlier in the year. So we do need to get more competitive. We do need to get the Korean economy to have higher productivity. Things that require are things like regulatory reform, more competition between Korean companies, labor market productivity, but existing interest groups, not only unions, but Korean firms, which have various economic rents because of various protections given to them by laws and regulations. So these interest groups make such reforms very difficult. And this Moon administration seems to be concentrating more on the demand side, or even restricting further the room to maneuver for Korean companies, rather than giving them more freedom and more room to try to raise their productivity. But we'll have to raise our productivity if we want to improve the economy and improve employment and raise wages down the line.
Well, staying on the subject of the government and the economy, the ruling party and the administration have approved revisions to 3 key laws related to the economy. These affect the Commercial Act, the law on fair trade, and the law on the regulation of financial groups. There's so much in these revisions to talk about, but tell us a bit about that.
Okay, well, there's so many diverse things that are included in these 3 laws that I'm only going to hit on the things that interest me. One is that now in Korea, traditionally, only the Fair Trade Commission was able to prosecute anti-competitive acts like collusion and misuse of market power. But now the Ministry of Justice, the prosecutor's office, can also investigate and prosecute such anti-competitive acts. This is actually similar to the United States, where the Federal Trade Commission and the Department of Justice have joint responsibility for controlling collusion. And then the penalties for collusions and misuse of market power has gone up. For example, for collusion, the maximum penalty rose from 10% of relevant sales to 20%. Misuse of market power penalties rose from 3% of relevant sales to 6% of relevant sales, but I think that's still very too low. As I mentioned in the last question, one of the big problems about Korea is that there's too little competition, so we really need to put a lot of force behind these anti-competitive fair trade acts. And then changes in Commercial Act includes changes in the legal responsibility of parent companies to their subsidiaries, and the parent companies may be liable for mismanagement of subsidiary companies. It also allows electronic elections of auditors and other officials of firms. Another change with these 3 laws is that the new laws limit the voting rights by major stockholders. It's aimed mostly at chaebol families, so no matter how much stock you have, even if you have 50 to 60%, you can only exercise 20% of the voting rights. I'm not sure if that's a good idea. Usually you want the decision to be in the hands of people who have most to lose, those who have most skin in the game, but limiting the voting rights to 20%, even if they have a lot more stock, seems to be the wrong way to go.
Fascinating point there, Professor. We'll have to leave it there for today. Thanks so much for coming on, as always.
Thank you.